We're diving deep into the ancient Egyptian legal system, and I promise you, this is going to be nothing like the dry history lesson you might remember from school. We're talking about real people, real crimes, real punishments, and a system of justice that was so advanced for its time that it would influence legal systems for thousands of years to come. Before we go back in time together, if you're enjoying settling in for the night with a bit of Egyptian history, consider hitting subscribe. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. So buckle up, because we're about to discover a legal system that was more sophisticated than you ever imagined. And we're going to do it through real evidence, real stories, and real people who lived and died under these laws thousands of years ago. Let's start our journey with a concept that's going to come up again and again throughout this story. It's a word that ancient Egyptians would have known from childhood, a word that shaped how they thought about everything from farming to family to crime and punishment. That word is ma'at. Now, here's the question that sets up everything else we're going to talk about. What happens when your entire legal system isn't based on laws written by kings or voted on by the people, but instead on maintaining cosmic balance in the universe? That's exactly what the ancient Egyptians believed. Ma'at wasn't just a set of rules. It was a goddess, a concept, and the very foundation of reality itself. Picture Ma'at as a young woman wearing an ostrich feather on her head. That feather is going to become incredibly important later when we talk about the afterlife. But for now, just know that Ma'at represented truth, justice, harmony, and balance. The ancient Egyptians believed that the entire universe operated on Ma'at. The sun rose each morning because of Ma'at. The Nile flooded each year at the right time because of Ma'at. Society functioned, crops grew, and life continued because Ma'at was being maintained. And here's the critical part. Every single person, from the pharaoh down to the poorest farmer, had a responsibility to uphold Ma'at through their actions. When someone committed a crime, they weren't just breaking a law, they were disrupting the cosmic order. They were creating Isfet, which was the opposite of Ma'at. Isfet meant chaos, lies, injustice, and disorder. And Isfet could literally tear apart the fabric of reality if it wasn't corrected. This is mind-blowing when you think about it. Imagine if every time someone stole something or lied in court, people genuinely believed it could contribute to the sun not rising tomorrow. That's the level of seriousness the ancient Egyptians attached to maintaining Ma'at. We know about Ma'at from thousands of sources. Tomb inscriptions where officials boast about upholding Ma'at. Temple walls showing pharaohs presenting Ma'at to the gods. Legal documents that invoke Ma'at as the standard by which cases should be judged. The teaching of Ptahhotep, one of the oldest books in the world written around 2400 BCE, dedicates huge portions to explaining how to live according to Ma'at. One of my favorite pieces of evidence comes from the tomb of Rekhmire, who was the Vizier under Pharaoh Thutmose III around 1450 BCE. A Vizier was basically the prime minister, the second most powerful person in Egypt. On the walls of Rekhmire's tomb, we can still read the instructions given to him about his duties. And right there, carved in stone, it says that the Vizier must judge according to Ma'at, show no favoritism, and treat rich and poor exactly the same. Here's another question for you. How do you think the pharaoh fit into this system? Was he above the law? This is where it gets really interesting. The pharaoh wasn't above Ma'at. In fact, the pharaoh's entire job was to maintain Ma'at throughout Egypt. Every morning, in temples all across Egypt, priests would perform a ritual where they presented a small statue of Ma'at to the gods. This was often done on behalf of the pharaoh. The message was clear. The king himself was accountable to Ma'at. Now, in practice, Could a pharaoh do whatever he wanted? Pretty much, yes. He was seen as a living god, after all. But there are actually cases we know about where pharaohs were criticized for violating Ma'at, and that criticism stuck. The pharaoh Akhenaten, who tried to replace all of Egypt's gods with worship of just one god, the sun disk Aten, was remembered as someone who violated Ma'at. After he died, his successors tried to erase his name from history. They called him the criminal of Akhetaten because he had disrupted the cosmic order. Let me give you a concrete example of how Ma'at worked in everyday legal situations. We have a document from around 1200 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses III, that records a court case. A man named Moses was fighting to reclaim land that he said belonged to his family. The case had actually been going on for generations. Moses stood before the court and presented his evidence. He had witnesses, documents, and genealogies going back 200 years. Throughout the entire testimony, which we can still read today on a stone stela now in the British Museum, Moses keeps invoking Ma'at. He doesn't just say this land is mine by law, he says it is Ma'at that this land belongs to my family. He's not just making a legal argument, he's making a cosmic one. If the judges rule against him unfairly, they're not just making a mistake, they're violating the fundamental order of the universe. The judges in that case ruled in Moses' favour, and they did so explicitly, according to Ma'at. The decision wasn't based on some written legal code, it was based on what restored balance and justice to the situation. This brings us to something really important to understand about Egyptian law. Unlike Roman law or modern law, the ancient Egyptians didn't have a comprehensive written legal code like the Code of Hammurabi from Babylon. We've never found an ancient Egyptian law book that says, if you steal a donkey, the punishment is X. Instead, Egyptian law was based on precedent, custom, and the principle of Ma'at. Judges looked at previous cases, considered what was fair, and made decisions based on maintaining cosmic balance. This gave the system a lot of flexibility, but it also meant that having a good lawyer who could argue persuasively about Ma'at was incredibly important. We know from numerous sources that legal training in ancient Egypt involved learning to speak persuasively, learning about past cases, and learning the principles of Ma'at. The Instruction of Amenemope, a wisdom text from around 1100 BCE, tells students, do not move the markers on the borders of fields, nor shift the position of the measuring cord. Do not be greedy for a cubit of land, nor encroach on the boundaries of a widow. This isn't just moral advice, this is legal training based on Ma'at. Here's something that surprised me when I first learned about it. The ancient Egyptians believed that speaking Ma'at, literally speaking truth and justice, had power. There are spells in the coffin texts, which are religious texts painted inside coffins, where the deceased person claims, I have done Ma'at, and I have spoken Ma'at as protective spells. Truth-telling wasn't just morally good, it was magically powerful. This had real implications for the legal system. Lying in court wasn't just perjury. It was a magical offence that could have cosmic consequences. We have records of oaths that people had to swear before testifying, and these oaths invoked the gods and Ma'at. Breaking such an oath could result in divine punishment, which Egyptians believed was absolutely real and could happen at any time. One of the most fascinating aspects of Ma'at in the legal system is how it applied to economic matters. The ancient Egyptians believed that fair economic exchange was part of Ma'at. If you sold grain, you had to use honest measures. If you hired a worker, you had to pay fair wages. If you borrowed something, you had to return it or its equivalent. We have evidence of this from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, which is one of the most well-documented communities from ancient Egypt. These were the workers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. They left behind thousands of ostraca, which are pieces of pottery or limestone that they used like notepaper. These ostraca record everything from shopping lists to court cases. One ostracon records a dispute over borrowed goods. A worker named Amenacht had borrowed a donkey from his neighbour Mena. When Amenacht returned the donkey, Mena claimed it was in worse condition than when he'd lent it. The case went before the local court, which was made up of the workers themselves. The court examined the donkey, heard testimony from both sides, and ruled that Amenacht had to compensate Mena because returning a borrowed item in worse condition violated Ma'at. This wasn't in any law book. This was common sense justice based on the principle that Ma'at required fair dealing. The court's job was to restore balance to the situation. Here's another question. If Ma'at was so important, how did the Egyptians teach it to children? We have amazing evidence about this. There's a whole genre of ancient Egyptian literature called instructions or teachings. These are basically wisdom texts where a father, often a high official, passes on advice to his son. The teaching of Ptahhotep, which I mentioned earlier, is the most famous example. It dates to around 2400 BCE, making it older than most of the Bible. These teachings are full of advice about maintaining Ma'at. If you are a man of standing, found a household, and love your wife at home as is fitting, fill her belly and clothe her back. Ointment is the prescription for her body. Make her heart glad as long as you live. She is a profitable field for her lord. This isn't just marriage advice. It's teaching that treating your wife well is part of maintaining Ma'at. Another teaching says, if you are a poor fellow, following a man of distinction, one of good standing with the god, know nothing of his former insignificance. Do not be puffed up against him on account of what you know of his former state. Respect him for what has accrued to him, for wealth does not come by itself. This is teaching that respecting social superiors, regardless of where they came from, maintains Ma'at. But here's what's really interesting. The teachings also emphasize that Ma'at protects the poor and weak. Do not be greedy in the division of things. Do not covet more than your share. Do not be greedy towards your relatives. Greater is the respect of the mild than of the strong. He who evades his relatives leaves himself unsupported. This is establishing that even in a hierarchical society, Ma'at required protecting family bonds and not exploiting the weak. These weren't just nice ideas. These principles show up again and again in actual court cases. We have records of cases where wealthy landowners were forced to respect the rights of poorer neighbours because Ma'at demanded it. We have cases where powerful officials were punished for abusing their positions because they violated Ma'at. One of the most famous examples comes from the story of the eloquent peasant, which is a literary text but one that tells us a lot about legal ideals. In this story, a peasant named Kun Anup is travelling with his donkeys loaded with goods when he's robbed by a corrupt official named Nemtinacht. The peasant goes to Nemtinacht's superior, the high steward Renzi, to seek justice. The peasant makes 9 incredible speeches appealing to Ma'at. He says things like, "Do Ma'at for the sake of the Lord of Ma'at. You are the steering oar of the entire land. The land sails according to your command. You are the equal of Thoth, who judges without being partial." He's telling the judge that judging fairly is literally what keeps reality functioning. In the end, the high steward tests the peasant by making him wait, wanting to hear all of his speeches. But ultimately, justice is done. The corrupt official is punished, and the peasant is compensated. The story ends with Ma'at being restored. Now, this is a fictional story, but it was incredibly popular. Copies of it have been found from different periods of Egyptian history. It was clearly used as a teaching tool about the legal system, and the message is clear. Even a poor peasant can appeal to Ma'at and receive justice from the highest authorities. This ideal didn't always match reality, of course. We have plenty of evidence that corruption existed, that the wealthy had advantages, and that justice wasn't always served. But the fact that Ma'at was the ideal meant that there was always a standard to appeal to. If you could argue convincingly that someone had violated Ma'at, you had a chance at justice. Let me give you one more piece of evidence about how seriously the Egyptians took Ma'at. In the Book of the Dead, which is a collection of spells meant to help the deceased navigate the afterlife, there's a section called the Negative Confession. This is where the dead person's heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. The deceased person has to stand before Osiris, the god of the dead, and declare all the things they didn't do. I have not committed sin. I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not stolen. I have not slain men or women. I have not made anyone suffer. I have not had sexual relations with a boy. I have not defiled myself. I have not caused anyone pain. I have not defrauded offerings. I have not added to the weights of the balance. I have not misread the pointer of the scales. This list goes on for 42 declarations, and every single one of them is basically a crime or sin against Ma'at. If the person's heart is heavier than the feather because they violated Ma'at, a monster called Amit devours their heart and they cease to exist. But if their heart balances with the feather, they get to enter the afterlife and live forever. Think about what this means. The ancient Egyptians believed that the same principles that governed the legal system in life would govern their judgment after death. Ma'at wasn't just for this world, it was eternal. This is why understanding Ma'at is absolutely essential to understanding the Egyptian legal system. Every court case, every judgment, every punishment, and every acquittal was ultimately about one thing: maintaining Ma'at, restoring balance, and ensuring that truth and justice prevailed over chaos and lies. In the next chapter, we're going to meet the people who were responsible for maintaining Ma'at through the legal system: the judges, the scribes, the police, and even the Pharaoh himself. Because Ma'at was the foundation, but it took real people doing real work to make the system function, and some of those people had jobs that would shock you. Chapter 2: The Guardians of Justice, Judges, Viziers, and the Pharaoh's Role. So now we understand that Ma'at was the foundation of everything in the Egyptian legal system. But who actually enforced it? Who were the people making these decisions, running the courts, and ensuring that justice was done? Here's the question that starts this chapter. In a civilization that lasted for 3,000 years and controlled territory from the Mediterranean to deep into Africa, how do you organize a legal system that can handle everything from a dispute over a borrowed donkey to conspiracies against the pharaoh himself? The answer is that the ancient Egyptians created a sophisticated hierarchy of courts and legal officials that would seem surprisingly familiar to anyone who knows modern legal systems. They had local courts for minor disputes, regional courts for more serious matters, and a supreme court headed by the Vizier himself. They had specialized judges, trained scribes, and even the equivalent of prosecutors and defense attorneys. Let's start at the top with the pharaoh, because understanding his role is crucial to understanding everything else. In theory, the pharaoh was the ultimate source of all justice in Egypt. He was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, and when he died, he would become one with Osiris. As a living god, the pharaoh's word was literally law. If he said something was Ma'at, then it was Ma'at. But here's the reality. Egypt was huge, and the pharaoh was one person. He couldn't personally judge every court case, settle every dispute, or oversee every legal matter. So the pharaoh delegated his authority through a carefully organized system. We know from numerous sources that the pharaoh did personally involve himself in major cases, especially those involving high officials, conspiracies, or matters of national importance. One of the most famous examples is the Harem conspiracy against Ramesses III, around 1155 BCE. This was a plot to assassinate the pharaoh, organized by one of his minor wives, who wanted her son to become pharaoh instead of the designated heir. The conspiracy involved dozens of people, including palace officials, army officers, and even some royal women. When the plot was discovered, Ramesses III personally ordered the investigation and trial. We actually have the court records from this case, recorded on a papyrus now known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin. It's an incredible document because it shows us exactly how high-level Egyptian justice worked. The pharaoh appointed a special court of 12 judges, all high officials. He gave them their instructions, which the papyrus records. As for these matters which these people, I know not who they are, have done, go and examine them. The phrasing is interesting. I know not who they are. The pharaoh is deliberately distancing himself from the accused, even though some of them were his own family members and close servants. He's saying that the court must judge them impartially, based on the evidence, according to Ma'at. The judges investigated, gathered evidence, heard testimony, and passed sentences. Some of the conspirators were sentenced to death. Others were allowed to take their own lives, which was seen as a more honourable punishment. Still others, particularly some of the women involved, had their noses and ears cut off, which was a standard punishment for serious crimes. But here's what's remarkable. Even with a crime as serious as attempting to assassinate the living God, the trial followed legal procedures. Evidence was presented. Testimony was heard. Punishments were proportional to the level of involvement. 3 of the judges were actually punished themselves for fraternizing with some of the accused women during the trial, which was seen as a violation of their judicial duties. This shows us that even at the highest levels, Egyptian justice was supposed to follow procedures and maintain ma'at. The pharaoh couldn't just execute everyone on a whim. He had to work through the legal system, even if that system ultimately derived its authority from him. For most legal matters, though, the pharaoh delegated his authority to the vizier. And the position of vizier is absolutely fascinating. The vizier was the highest official in Egypt below the pharaoh. In the Old Kingdom, there was one vizier. Later, during the New Kingdom, there were 2 viziers, one for Upper Egypt and one for Lower Egypt. The vizier was responsible for basically running the entire country. Taxation, public works, military logistics, temple administration, and crucially, the legal system. We know an incredible amount about what viziers did because several of them left detailed inscriptions in their tombs describing their duties. The most famous is from the tomb of Rekhmire, who was vizier under Thutmose III and his son Amenhotep II around 1450 BCE. On the walls of Rekhmire's tomb at Thebes, we can still read what's called the installation of the vizier, which is basically a job description. It says, "The vizier shall sit on a seat with a rug on the floor and a cushion under his back, a rug under his feet, and a baton near him. Then the officials shall stand near him. Then one shall be announced to him after the other, without allowing one who is far to be announced before one who is near." This describes the vizier's court. He sat in judgment every day, and people came before him in order. No cutting in line, no favoritism based on wealth or status. Everyone got their turn. The installation text continues with instructions about how the vizier must judge. "Regard one you know like one you don't know, one who is near you like one far from you. Do not avoid a petitioner nor nod your head when he states his case. Do not be angry with a man wrongfully. Be angry at that about which one should be angry." These aren't just nice sentiments. These are actual job requirements. The vizier must be impartial, must listen to all cases equally, and must only show anger when anger is justified by a violation of ma'at. The text also says something really powerful. It is an abomination of the God to show partiality. This is the teaching, therefore do accordingly. Look on him who is known to you like him who is unknown to you, and him who is near the king like him who is far from his house. Even someone close to the pharaoh must be judged the same as a stranger if they violated ma'at. This is the ideal, at least. And we have evidence that sometimes this ideal was actually upheld. One of the most important cases we know about from ancient Egypt is the trial of the tomb robbers during the reign of Ramesses IX, around 1110 BCE. This case is known from several papyri, especially the Leopold Amherst papyrus and the Abbott papyrus. During this period, Egypt was having serious economic problems. Royal authority was weakening, and crime was increasing. Some people started robbing the ancient tombs in the Theban necropolis, including the tombs of pharaohs from earlier dynasties. This wasn't just theft, this was sacrilege of the highest order, violating the tombs of divine kings. The vizier at the time was a man named Kamwaset. He organized a massive investigation involving multiple courts. Dozens of people were arrested and interrogated. The papyri record their testimonies in detail, and they're fascinating because they show us how Egyptian courts actually functioned. Suspects were brought before the court and questioned. If they didn't confess, they could be beaten with sticks or twisted into painful positions. This was standard practice in ancient Egyptian justice. The idea was that the truth would be literally beaten out of someone who was lying. Confessions obtained this way were considered valid evidence. We'll talk more about this when we get to punishments, but for now, the important point is that even with torture being used, there was still a formal investigation. Evidence was gathered. Multiple witnesses were questioned. The location of stolen goods was verified. Some people who were accused were actually found innocent and released because the evidence didn't support the charges. The vizier oversaw this entire process. He reported to the pharaoh, but he ran the investigation and the trials. This shows us that the vizier's court was where serious crimes were judged. But what about less serious matters? What about the everyday disputes over property, debts, divorces, and inheritances that must have made up the vast majority of legal cases? For these, ancient Egypt had local courts called Kenbet, which is usually translated as council or tribunal. These were groups of respected local citizens who gathered to judge disputes in their communities. We know a huge amount about how these courts worked, especially from the village of Deir el-Medina, which I mentioned earlier. Deir el-Medina was the village where the workers who built the royal tombs lived. It existed for about 400 years during the New Kingdom, and the workers left behind thousands of written records. Among these are dozens of records of local court cases, and they give us an incredible window into how ordinary Egyptian justice worked. The Kenbet at Deir el-Medina was made up of the village's leading citizens. Usually about 8 to 16 men would serve on the court at any given time. They weren't professional judges. They were workers, foremen, scribes, and other skilled craftsmen who took turns serving on the tribunal. The cases they heard were exactly what you'd expect in any small community. A woman named Heria sued her ex-husband for not returning her dowry after their divorce. A man named Paneb was accused by multiple neighbors of various crimes, including theft, assault, and adultery. Workers sued their foremen for unfair treatment. People sued each other over borrowed tools, property boundaries, and inheritances. These cases were heard publicly. The entire village could attend. Both sides would present their arguments and evidence. Witnesses would testify. Sometimes written documents would be presented as evidence. Sometimes physical evidence, like property markers or disputed objects, would be brought before the court. The Kenbet would deliberate and reach a verdict. Their decisions were recorded by scribes on ostraca or papyri. Both parties would be expected to abide by the decision, and if they didn't, they could face additional penalties. One of my favourite cases from Deir el-Medina involves a woman named Naunakte. She was elderly and wanted to write a will disinheriting 4 of her 8 children because they hadn't taken care of her in her old age. Egyptian law allowed children to inherit from their parents automatically, but now Nakhte went before the Kenbet to make a formal declaration that these 4 children would get nothing. The court record is preserved on a papyrus. Nakhte stated her case. "Look, I am growing old, and they are not looking after me. Whoever of them has aided me, to him I will give of my property. Whoever has not given to me, to him I will not give of my property." The Kenbet listened to her testimony. They questioned the children involved. They ruled in Nakhte's favour, supporting her right to disinherit children who had violated their duty to care for their elderly mother. This was Ma'at in action. Children were expected to honour their parents, and if they didn't, they could face consequences. What's really interesting about the Kenbet system is that it was democratic in a way that most ancient legal systems weren't. Yes, Egypt was an absolute monarchy, with the pharaoh as a living god. But at the local level, ordinary citizens judged each other's disputes. They didn't need permission from the pharaoh or the vizier to hold court. They just did it, as part of maintaining Ma'at in their community. We also have evidence of more specialized courts for specific types of cases. Temple courts handled disputes involving temple property and religious matters. Military courts judged cases involving soldiers. Trade courts in port cities like Memphis handled commercial disputes between Egyptian and foreign merchants. All of these courts operated under the same basic principle. They existed to maintain Ma'at by resolving disputes, punishing crimes, and ensuring that truth and justice prevailed. Now, let's talk about the people who made all of this documentation possible. The scribes. In ancient Egypt, being a scribe was one of the most prestigious professions you could have. Scribes were literate in a society where probably only about 1% of the population could read and write. They went through years of training, learning to write in hieroglyphics and in hieratic script, which was the cursive form used for everyday documents. Legal scribes had specialized training. They learned the formulas for writing contracts, court records, wills, property deeds, and other legal documents. They learned about past court cases to understand precedents. They learned about Ma'at and how to apply it to different situations. In court, scribes recorded everything. We have court records that include verbatim testimony, descriptions of evidence, records of verdicts, and even sometimes notes about how witnesses behaved. Some court records include marginal notes where scribes made personal comments about cases, showing that they weren't just passive recorders, but active participants in the legal process. Scribes could also serve as advocates. If you had a case before the Kenbet or a higher court, you might hire a scribe to help you prepare your argument, draft documents, and speak on your behalf. The eloquent peasant in the story I mentioned earlier was unusual precisely because he could speak for himself so effectively. Most ordinary people needed help navigating the legal system, and scribes provided that help. One of the most important roles scribes played was in creating and maintaining contracts. Ancient Egyptians used written contracts for all sorts of things: sales of property, loans, marriages, divorces, adoptions, apprenticeships, and business partnerships. These contracts were legally binding, and they were witnessed and sealed. We have thousands of these contracts preserved. One famous example is a marriage contract from 310 BCE, late in Egyptian history during the Ptolemaic period. The contract is between a man named Heraclides and a woman named Demetria. It's written in Greek because by this time Greek was becoming common in Egypt, but it follows Egyptian legal traditions. The contract specifies what each party is bringing to the marriage. Heraclides provides a house and furnishings. Demetria provides a dowry of gold and silver. The contract specifies that if they divorce, Demetria gets her dowry back plus a portion of the property they've acquired together. If Heraclides takes another wife or has a child with another woman, he must pay Demetria a substantial penalty. This contract was drawn up by scribes, witnessed by 6 people, and legally registered. If either party violated its terms, the other could take them to court, and this written document would be the primary evidence. The importance of written documentation in Egyptian law cannot be overstated. Unlike some ancient societies where oral agreements and personal oaths were sufficient, Egyptians loved paperwork. If it wasn't written down and witnessed, it could be very difficult to prove in court. This created a system where scribes had tremendous power. If you needed to write a will, draft a contract, or prepare a case for court, you needed a scribe, and scribes charged fees for their services. This meant that while the legal system was theoretically open to everyone, in practice, wealthier people who could afford better scribal services had an advantage. We have complaints about this. One wisdom text warns against scribes who overcharge or who draft documents deceptively to favor one party over another. The instructions of Amenemop says, "Do not alter the accounts of a scribe, nor falsify the writings of a document. Do not move the marker on the boundaries of fields." Scribes who violated Ma'at through deceptive documentation were seen as particularly dangerous because they could create injustice while making it look legal. Despite these warnings, scribes remained essential to the legal system. Every court had its scribes. Every temple had its archive of legal documents. Every administrative center had scribes who recorded land ownership, tax payments, and legal judgments. One more category of legal officials deserves mention: the police. Yes, ancient Egypt had police. They were called medjay originally, though this term evolved over time. In the Old Kingdom, the medjay were actually Nubian mercenaries employed to patrol the deserts and protect trade routes. By the New Kingdom, medjay had become a general term for police officers, regardless of their ethnic origin. Police officers investigated crimes, arrested suspects, guarded prisoners, and carried out punishments. They worked under the authority of local governors and ultimately the Vizier. In cities and large towns, there were police stations where officers were based. We know about Egyptian police from many sources. Tomb paintings show police officers carrying sticks, which were their symbol of authority. Court records mention police bringing in suspects and witnesses. Administrative documents record the assignment of police to guard temples, royal workshops, and other important locations. At Deir el-Medina, we have records of the village police force. These were guards who patrolled the valley where the royal tombs were being built, preventing unauthorized access and watching for tomb robbers. Some of the police officers left records of their patrols, noting when they checked different areas and whether they saw anything suspicious. One police report from Deir el-Medina is particularly charming. A police officer named Amenemopet recorded, "I went up to make the evening patrol. I reached the area of the great tombs. I found nothing. The night patrol was good." It's almost like a modern police log entry. Police could also be called to help enforce court judgments. If the Kenbet ruled that someone had to pay a debt and they refused, police could seize their property. If someone was sentenced to a beating, police carried it out. If someone was sentenced to forced labor, police ensured they showed up for work. The existence of police shows us that Egyptian law wasn't just theoretical. It was enforced by people with the authority to compel compliance. You couldn't just ignore a court judgment. If you did, men with sticks would show up at your door. So to summarize what we've learned in this chapter, the Egyptian legal system had multiple layers of courts and officials. At the top was the pharaoh, the ultimate source of justice but too busy to judge most cases personally. Below him was the Vizier, who ran the supreme court and oversaw the entire legal system. Below the Vizier were various levels of courts, from specialized tribunals to local Kenbets staffed by ordinary citizens. Supporting all of this were scribes who documented everything, and police who enforced judgments. This was a sophisticated system, one that allowed Egypt to function as a unified state for 3,000 years, despite its enormous size and population. And it was all built on the foundation of Ma'at, with every official expected to uphold truth and justice in their decisions. In the next chapter, we're going to look at how this system actually worked in practice. What happened when someone committed a crime? How did investigations work? What counted as evidence? And how did trials proceed from accusation to verdict? We're going to walk through the Egyptian justice process step by step, using real cases to illustrate how it all worked. Chapter 3: Crime and Investigation. How the system actually worked. Now that we understand the principles behind Egyptian law and the people who enforced it, let's get into the really interesting part. What actually happened when a crime was committed? Here's the question that's going to guide us through this chapter. If you were an ancient Egyptian and someone wronged you, maybe they stole your donkey or cheated you in a business deal or assaulted you on the street, what would you actually do about it? What was the process from crime to justice? The answer is that ancient Egypt had a surprisingly well-developed system for reporting crimes, investigating them, gathering evidence, and bringing cases to trial. And we know about this system in remarkable detail because the Egyptians documented everything. Let's start with how crimes got reported in the first place. If you were the victim of a crime, your first step was usually to go to the local authorities. Depending on where you lived and what kind of crime had occurred, this might mean going to the local Kenbet, to a police station, or to the office of a local governor or other official. We have many documents recording the initial complaints. They follow a pretty standard formula. The complainant would identify themselves, state what had happened, and ask for the authorities to take action. Often these complaints would be addressed to a specific official, appealing to their duty to uphold Ma'at. One example comes from a papyrus letter written by a man named Amenakt to his superior official. Amenakt writes, "My donkey was stolen on the 15th day of the 3rd month of the inundation season. I made a report to the police on that very day. The police officer Neferkare said he would investigate, but 10 days have passed and nothing has been done. I appeal to you to ensure that justice is done, for you are a judge who upholds Ma'at." This letter shows us several things. First, there was an expectation that crimes would be reported quickly. Amenemhat reported his stolen donkey on the same day it disappeared. Second, there were designated officials, like the police officer Neferkare, responsible for investigating. Third, if those officials didn't do their jobs, you could appeal to their superiors. And fourth, invoking Ma'at was a way to pressure officials to act. Did this particular appeal work? We don't know because we only have the letter, not the response. But the fact that Amenemhat wrote it, and presumably sent it, shows that there was a system for escalating complaints. For more serious crimes, especially those involving violence or significant property, investigations would begin immediately. Let's walk through how these investigations worked, using one of the most extensively documented cases from ancient Egypt, the tomb robbery trials I mentioned earlier. During the reign of Ramesses IX, around 1110 BCE, reports started coming in that tombs in the Theban necropolis were being robbed. This was a massive scandal because these weren't ordinary tombs. These were the tombs of pharaohs, queens, and high nobles from previous dynasties. These tombs were supposed to be protected by religious sanctity, by guards, and by terrible curses. Yet they were being systematically looted. The mayor of Thebes, a man named Parsa, made a formal accusation. He claimed that 10 royal tombs and 4 tombs of priestesses of Amun had been violated. He accused the mayor of Western Thebes, a man named Pawera, of not properly protecting the tombs under his jurisdiction. This accusation went to the Vizier, Kenbet, who ordered a full investigation. And here's where it gets really interesting, because we have detailed records of how this investigation proceeded. First, the Vizier appointed a commission of inquiry. This commission included high officials, scribes, to record everything, and police to make arrests. The commission's first task was to verify whether the accusations were true. Were the tombs actually robbed? The commission went to the necropolis and physically examined the tombs that Parsa had claimed were violated. This is recorded in the Abbot Papyrus. For each tomb, the commission noted its location, its condition, and whether it showed signs of robbery. Their findings were recorded like this. The pyramid tomb of King Amenhotep I. It was found intact. The pyramid tomb of King Intef. It was found intact. The pyramid tomb of King Intef the Great. It was found to have been broken into by the thieves. Out of the tombs Parsa had accused of being robbed, the commission found that most were actually intact. Only a few showed signs of robbery. This was actually embarrassing for Parsa, and politically it played into rivalries between him and Pawera. But for our purposes, what matters is that the commission physically verified the facts before proceeding. For the tombs that were robbed, the next step was to find the perpetrators. The police began making arrests based on information from informants. This is where the investigation gets dark, because it involved torture. Several men were arrested, including stonemasons, water carriers, and other workers who had access to the necropolis. They were brought before the commission and interrogated under torture. The records are explicit about this. He was examined by beating with the stick and by twisting his feet and hands. Under this torture, suspects confessed. One man, a stonemason named Amenhotep, gave an incredibly detailed confession that's preserved in the Leopold Amherst papyrus. He said, "We went to rob the tombs in accordance with our regular habit, and we found the pyramid tomb of King Sekhemre Shed-Tawi. We took our copper tools and we broke into this pyramid through its innermost part. We found its underground chambers, and we took lighted candles in our hands, and we went down." Amenhotep's confession continues for several paragraphs. He describes exactly how they broke into the tomb, what they found, how they divided the loot, and who else was involved. He names his accomplices. He describes where they sold the stolen goods. He even describes robbing multiple tombs over several years. This confession is remarkable for its detail, but we have to remember it was obtained through torture. Modern legal systems reject torture because it can produce false confessions. People will say anything to make the pain stop. But in ancient Egypt, torture was considered a legitimate way to get at the truth. The thinking was that a person telling lies to protect themselves would break under torture and speak ma'at. Based on confessions like Amenhotep's, more arrests were made. Eventually, dozens of people were implicated in the tomb robberies. The investigation revealed an extensive criminal network involving not just the robbers themselves, but also receivers of stolen goods, corrupt guards who looked the other way, and even some officials who took bribes. The commission presented all of this evidence to the court. The trials proceeded with the evidence being read out, the accused being questioned again, and witnesses testifying. The papyri record testimony from people who bought stolen goods, from guards who admitted to being bribed, and from accomplices who turned on each other. The verdicts were harsh. The actual tomb robbers were sentenced to death, probably by impalement, which was the standard punishment for very serious crimes. Those who had bought stolen goods or helped fence them were sentenced to beatings and mutilation, typically having their noses and ears cut off. Corrupt guards were severely punished as well. But what's important for understanding the Egyptian legal system is that this investigation, as brutal as it was, followed procedures. There was a formal accusation. There was an investigation to verify the facts. There was gathering of evidence. There were arrests, interrogations, and confessions. There was a trial before judges, and there were sentences based on the severity of each person's involvement. This wasn't random justice. This was a system, and the system left records that we can still read more than 3,000 years later. Now let's talk about evidence, because the tomb robbery case shows us several types of evidence that Egyptian courts accepted. First, there was physical evidence. The commission examined the tombs themselves to verify whether they'd been robbed. In other cases, physical evidence might include stolen goods, weapons used in crimes, forged documents, or damaged property. Courts could and did examine physical evidence directly. Second, there were confessions. As we've seen, these were often obtained through torture, but they were considered the strongest form of evidence. If someone confessed, especially if their confession included details that could be verified, the case was essentially proven. Third, there was testimony from witnesses. If someone saw a crime occur or had relevant information, they could be called to testify. Witnesses would swear oaths before the gods to tell the truth. Breaking such an oath was believed to bring divine punishment, so it was taken very seriously. We have records of witness testimony from many cases. In the Deir el-Medina records, there's a case where a man named Paneb was accused of various crimes. Multiple witnesses came forward to testify. One man testified that he saw Paneb steal tools from the royal workshop. A woman testified that Paneb had assaulted her. Another man testified that Paneb had committed adultery with his wife. Each witness gave their testimony before the Kenbet. The accused, Paneb, was given the opportunity to respond to the accusations. He denied some charges, tried to explain away others, and attacked the credibility of some witnesses. The court had to weigh all of this testimony and decide who was telling the truth. In Paneb's case, the sheer number of witnesses and the consistency of their accounts seems to have convinced the court that he was guilty. He was removed from his position as a foreman and punished, though the exact punishment isn't recorded. Fourth, there were written documents, contracts, property deeds, wills, receipts, and other documents could all be presented as evidence. The Egyptians' love of documentation meant that many disputes could be settled by simply producing the right paperwork. Remember the case of Moses that I mentioned earlier? His land dispute case relied heavily on written evidence. Moses produced documents showing that his family had owned the land for generations. He had wills, property transfers, tax records, and other documents stretching back 200 years. His opponents couldn't produce comparable documentation, so the court ruled in Moses' favor. The importance of written evidence meant that forging documents was a serious crime. We have records of cases where people were accused of creating fake property deeds or altering wills. Such crimes were seen as particularly evil because they violated Ma'at through deception while hiding behind the appearance of legitimate documentation. Fifth, there was circumstantial evidence and logical reasoning. Courts didn't just accept evidence blindly. They evaluated whether it made sense. If someone was accused of stealing but had a solid alibi, that mattered. If someone had a clear motive for a crime that could be used against them. There's a fascinating case from Deir el-Medina where a worker was accused of stealing a tool. The evidence against him was circumstantial. The tool had gone missing from a workshop where he worked. Someone saw him acting suspiciously around the time it disappeared. He suddenly had money to buy things when he'd been poor before. The accused man defended himself by arguing that he'd earned the money legitimately through extra work. He produced a witness who confirmed this. The Kenbet had to weigh the circumstantial evidence of suspicious behavior against his explanation and supporting witness. In the end, they found him not guilty because the prosecution couldn't prove beyond doubt that he'd taken the tool. This shows that Egyptian courts did sometimes acquit people when the evidence wasn't strong enough. It wasn't a system where every accusation led to conviction. There had to be proof. Now let's talk about the trial process itself. How did a case actually proceed once it came to court? For a local Kenbet hearing a minor case, the process was relatively informal. The court would convene at an agreed time and place, often in a public area where community members could watch. Both parties would be notified to appear. The accuser would present their case first. They would state what had happened and what remedy they sought. If they had evidence or witnesses, they would present those. If they'd hired a scribe to help them, the scribe might speak on their behalf, though the accuser could also speak for themselves. Then the accused would respond. They could deny the charges, provide an alternative explanation, present their own evidence, or argue that even if the facts were true, they didn't violate ma'at in the way claimed. The court would ask questions. Remember, the judges weren't neutral referees like in modern courts. They actively investigated the truth. They would probe inconsistencies, demand clarification, and sometimes even send people to gather additional information before making a decision. After hearing from both sides, the judges would deliberate. Sometimes this happened immediately, with the judges conferring briefly and then announcing a verdict. Other times, especially for complex cases, the court might adjourn and reconvene days or even weeks later after considering the evidence. When the court reached a decision, it would be announced publicly and recorded by a scribe. The decision would typically include both a verdict on the facts of the case and an order for how to remedy the situation. The court finds that the defendant did borrow the cloak from the plaintiff and failed to return it. The defendant shall return a cloak of equal value to the plaintiff within 10 days. Both parties were expected to comply with the court's decision. If the losing party refused, the court could order enforcement, usually through seizure of property or in serious cases through physical punishment or imprisonment. For higher courts, like those presided over by regional governors or the Vizier himself, the process was more formal. Cases had to be submitted in writing. Official summons would be sent to parties requiring their appearance. The proceedings were more carefully documented, with scribes recording not just the verdict but often extensive details of the arguments and evidence. The trial of the tomb robbers shows us this more formal process. The indictments were written out. The accused were formally charged. The interrogations and confessions were recorded verbatim. The judges deliberated based on the written record. The sentences were formally pronounced and recorded. One aspect of Egyptian trials that's interesting is that there doesn't seem to have been a presumption of innocence in the way modern Western law has. The mere fact of being accused, especially if the accusation came from a credible person, put you in a position where you needed to prove your innocence. This was especially true in cases involving torture. If you were accused of a serious crime and brought in for interrogation, you might be tortured to get a confession even before the court had determined you were guilty. The thinking was that an innocent person would maintain their innocence even under torture, while a guilty person would break and confess. We know this didn't always work. There are cases where people confessed under torture and then recanted their confessions later. The courts didn't always know what to do with this. Generally, if someone confessed and gave details that could be verified, the confession would stand, even if they later recanted. But if the confession couldn't be corroborated, the court might be more skeptical. Another interesting aspect of Egyptian trials was the use of oracles. In some cases, especially during the later New Kingdom, people would take their disputes to oracles. They would write their question or describe their case on ostraca, then present them to a statue of a god during a religious procession. The priests carrying the statue would move forward or back, and this movement would be interpreted as the god's answer. This sounds like superstition to modern ears, but we have to remember that Egyptians genuinely believed the gods cared about ma'at and would make their will known. An oracle's decision could settle a dispute just as effectively as a court judgment, and it had the advantage of being divinely ordained and thus unchallengeable. We have records of cases being decided by oracles. One text records, "The workman Amenemope came before the god and said, 'My superior took my chisel and will not return it.' The god gave answer that it was so. Based on the oracle's confirmation, the superior was ordered to return the chisel. This mixing of religious and legal procedures might seem strange, but it made perfect sense in a society where law, religion, and cosmic order were all part of the same system of ma'at. Let's look at one more complete case to see how all of this came together in practice. This is a case from around 1200 BCE involving a woman named Eritnefret and her dispute with her brother over inheritance. Their father had died and left property including land, a house, and various goods. The father had made a will, but it was ambiguous about exactly how the property should be divided. Eritnefret believed she was entitled to half of everything. Her brother argued that as the male heir, he should get the house and the land, while she should only get movable goods. Eritnefret brought the case before the local Kenbet. She presented the written will, which the court examined. She brought witnesses who testified about their father's intentions based on things he'd said before his death. She argued that ma'at required fair treatment of all children, not just sons. Her brother presented his case. He cited custom that sons inherit land and houses. He argued that their father had intended this, even if the will wasn't perfectly clear. He brought his own witnesses who testified that the father had spoken of the son inheriting the family property. The court deliberated. They examined the will carefully. They listened to all the witnesses. They considered both the letter of the written document and the broader principles of ma'at. In the end, they reached a compromise. The brother would inherit the house and most of the land in accordance with custom, but Eritnefret would receive a specific plot of land that had been part of her mother's dowry, plus half of the movable goods and an additional payment of silver from her brother to make the division more equitable. This decision tried to balance multiple considerations: the custom of sons inheriting real property, the principle of fair treatment, the specific provisions of the will, and the goal of maintaining family harmony. It wasn't a win or loss for either side. It was a solution aimed at restoring ma'at to a situation that had been thrown into disorder by their father's death. Both siblings accepted the court's decision. It was recorded in writing. Property was transferred, and the case was closed. This is the Egyptian legal system at work. It wasn't perfect. It could be harsh. It could be unfair. Wealthier people with better legal representation had advantages. Torture was used. Punishments could be brutal. But it was a system with procedures, with standards of evidence, with opportunities for both sides to be heard, and with decisions based on principles of justice and cosmic order. In the next chapter, we're going to look at what happened when people were found guilty. What were the punishments used in ancient Egypt? How did they decide who got what punishment? And were there alternatives to punishment? We're going to explore everything from fines to forced labor to the death penalty, and some of what we find might surprise you. Chapter 4: Justice and Punishment. From fines to the death penalty. So you've been found guilty in an ancient Egyptian court. The judges have deliberated. The verdict has been announced, and you violated ma'at. Now what? What's about to happen to you? Here's the question that's going to guide us through this chapter. How does a civilization balance the need for punishment with the goal of restoring cosmic order? And what does that actually look like in practice? The answer is that ancient Egypt had a remarkably diverse system of punishments, ranging from simple fines and restitution to mutilation, forced labor, and execution. The punishment you received depended on several factors. What crime did you commit? How serious was it? Were you a repeat offender? What was your social status? And crucially, did your punishment restore ma'at, or did it just create more isfet? Let's start with the most common punishments, the ones that ordinary people would have encountered most often. These were fines and restitution. If you stole something, the standard punishment was to return what you stole plus additional compensation. The amount varied, but we have records showing that thieves often had to pay back double or even triple the value of what they'd stolen. This wasn't arbitrary. The thinking was that theft created an imbalance. The victim lost something, and the thief gained it. Simply returning the item would restore the material balance, but wouldn't address the violation of ma'at. So the thief had to pay extra as a way of rebalancing the cosmic scales. We have a great example from Deir el-Medina. A worker named Kenna was caught stealing a tool from a fellow worker. The Kenbet found him guilty and ordered him to return the tool plus pay the equivalent value in grain. But that wasn't all. Kenna was also required to publicly apologize before the entire village and swear an oath that he wouldn't steal again. The public apology was important because theft wasn't just a crime against the individual victim. It was a crime against the community's ma'at. For disputes over debts, the punishment for non-payment was usually seizure of property. If you owed someone grain and didn't pay, the court could order that your livestock, tools, or other property be seized to cover the debt. This was enforced by the local police, who would literally show up and take your stuff. But here's something interesting. Egyptian law recognized that sometimes people couldn't pay their debts through no fault of their own. Maybe the harvest failed, or they got sick and couldn't work. In these cases, courts could be surprisingly lenient. We have cases where debt payments were deferred, where payment plans were arranged, or where creditors were told they had to accept partial payment. One case from the late New Kingdom involves a woman named Irenifer who owed a substantial debt to a merchant. She couldn't pay because her husband had died and she was struggling to support her children. The merchant took her to court demanding payment. The Kenbet ruled that Irenifer did owe the debt, but they gave her 2 years to pay it back in installments. This was ma'at in action, balancing the creditor's right to payment with compassion for someone in genuine hardship. Now let's move to more serious punishments. Physical punishment in the form of beatings. Beating with sticks or rods was an extremely common punishment in ancient Egypt, used for a wide range of crimes, from minor theft to assault to fraud. The number of blows varied based on the severity of the crime. We have records mentioning sentences of anywhere from 5 blows to 200 blows. These beatings weren't symbolic. They were brutal physical punishments that could cause serious injury or even death, especially when the number of blows was high. The beatings were typically administered by police officers and were carried out publicly as a deterrent to others. We know about beatings from many sources: court records that specify beating as the punishment, administrative documents that record how many times prisoners were beaten, even artistic depictions showing beatings being administered. One tomb painting shows a tax collector being beaten for corruption with the inscription, "The punishment for those who violate ma'at." Who got beaten? Pretty much anyone could be sentenced to beating, but it was especially common for lower status people. If a wealthy person and a poor person committed the same crime, the wealthy person might be able to pay a fine while the poor person got beaten. This reveals one of the inequalities in the Egyptian system. In theory, ma'at applied equally to everyone. In practice, wealth provided some protection. There was also beating as part of interrogation, which we've already discussed. This was distinct from beating as punishment. Interrogatory beating was meant to extract confessions or information. Punitive beating was meant to inflict suffering as payback for wrongdoing. Moving up the scale of severity, we come to mutilation. And this is where things get genuinely brutal. Mutilation involved cutting off body parts as punishment for serious crimes. The most common forms were cutting off the nose, cutting off the ears, or cutting off the nose and ears together. These punishments were used for crimes like adultery, serious theft, perjury, and corruption by officials. Why mutilation? There were several reasons. First, it was a permanent mark of shame. Everyone who saw you would know you'd committed a serious crime. You couldn't hide it or escape from it. In a society where honor and reputation mattered enormously, this was devastating. Second, mutilation was seen as making the punishment fit the crime in some cases. If you committed perjury, you'd lied with your mouth, so your face was marked. If you'd stolen sacred objects with your hands, your hand might be cut off. This was the principle of proportional justice. Third, mutilation was considered more merciful than execution. If you'd committed a crime serious enough to deserve death, having your nose and ears cut off but being allowed to live was actually showing mercy. You could still work, still support yourself and your family, still participate in society to some degree. You just had to do it while bearing the permanent mark of your crime. We have evidence of mutilation punishments from several sources. The tomb robbery trials mention several people being sentenced to have their noses and ears cut off. Medical texts describe how to treat wounds from judicial mutilation, suggesting it was common enough that doctors needed to know how to handle it. And we even have a few mummies that show signs of having had their noses or ears removed in a way consistent with judicial mutilation. One of the crimes that commonly resulted in mutilation was adultery. If a married person had sexual relations with someone other than their spouse, both parties could be punished. The evidence for this comes from legal documents and also from wisdom literature that warns about the consequences of adultery. The Instruction of Ani, a wisdom text from around 1300 BCE, warns, "Do not have sex with a married woman. He who has sex with a woman in the street, her punishment is executed against him." The punishment mentioned here was often mutilation of the nose for women and beating or mutilation for men, though practices varied over time and place. Another crime that could result in mutilation was serious fraud, especially by officials. Remember those 3 judges from the Harem conspiracy trial who were punished for fraternizing with the accused? The papyrus records that they had their noses and ears cut off because they had violated their judicial oath and corrupted the trial process. Even high officials weren't immune to mutilation if they seriously violated ma'at. Now let's talk about forced labor. This was a punishment that served multiple purposes. Forced labor meant being sent to work on state projects like quarries, mines, building projects, or agricultural estates. It could be a sentence of a specific duration, like 1 year or 5 years, or in serious cases, it could be for life. Some forced labor sentences were essentially death sentences because the conditions were so harsh that many people didn't survive. Working in the quarries or mines was particularly brutal. The heat was intense, the work was backbreaking, food and water were limited, and there was always the risk of rockfalls or other accidents. We have letters from overseers of forced labor camps describing the harsh conditions and high death rates. But forced labor also served practical purposes. Egypt always needed workers for its massive building projects. Using convicted criminals as forced labor meant these projects could be completed without taking farmers away from their fields or craftsmen away from their workshops. It was economically efficient. We know about forced labor punishments from several sources: court records that sentence people to forced labor, administrative documents that track the assignment of convicted criminals to different work projects, letters from officials requesting more workers for their projects, and even graffiti from workers at quarry sites, some of which was left by people serving forced labor sentences. One interesting aspect of forced labor is that it could sometimes be commuted or shortened. If you had family or friends with influence, they might be able to petition for your early release. If you performed your work exceptionally well, you might earn time off your sentence. There was even a concept somewhat like parole, where people serving forced labor sentences could be released early if they demonstrated rehabilitation. Now we come to the death penalty, the ultimate punishment. Ancient Egypt definitely had capital punishment, though it seems to have been reserved for the most serious crimes. Murder, treason, tomb robbery, serious corruption, plotting against the pharaoh. and some cases of sacrilege could all be punished by death. There were different methods of execution, and they carried different meanings. The most common method mentioned in records is impalement. This involved tying the condemned person to a stake and leaving them to die, or in some cases, actually impaling them on a stake driven through their body. It was an agonizing death and was used for the worst criminals. Another method was burning. This was particularly used for women who committed certain crimes, possibly including serious cases of prostitution or sexual crimes. Burning was seen as completely destroying the person, which had religious implications. If your body was burned, you couldn't be properly mummified, which meant you couldn't reach the afterlife. This was punishment that extended beyond death. Decapitation is also mentioned in some sources, though less frequently. This was considered a quicker and perhaps more merciful form of execution. Interestingly, we have very few artistic depictions of executions from ancient Egypt. This might be because the Egyptians believed that depicting something gave it power and permanence. Showing executions in tomb art or temple reliefs might have been seen as allowing Isfet, chaos and disorder, to persist even in sacred spaces. But we do have written records. The tomb robbers, as I mentioned, were likely executed by impalement. The harem conspiracy records show that some of the conspirators were allowed to take their own lives, which was actually seen as a more honourable form of execution. Instead of being publicly killed, they were given the option to commit suicide, probably by poison. This preserved some dignity for them and their families. One question that comes up is whether ancient Egypt had anything like a presumption against the death penalty or requirements for multiple witnesses before execution. The evidence is mixed. We know that serious crimes required strong evidence, and torture was used partly to ensure that people were truly guilty before they were executed. But there don't seem to have been the kinds of procedural protections that some other ancient legal systems had. Now here's something fascinating. Ancient Egypt also had something that looks remarkably like sanctuary or asylum. Temples could offer protection to people fleeing from punishment. If you committed a crime and ran to a temple and grabbed hold of a statue or altar, you were under the protection of the god. The police and courts had to respect this. You couldn't be dragged out of the temple by force. This didn't mean you were free. You couldn't leave the temple without facing arrest, but it gave you time to negotiate with your accusers, time to raise money to pay restitution or a fine, time for tempers to cool, and for people to reconsider whether the punishment was proportional to the crime. We have several cases where temple sanctuary played a role. One text from Deir el-Medina mentions a worker who fled to the local temple after being accused of theft. He spent several days there while his family negotiated with the victim. Eventually, they reached an agreement where the worker would pay double restitution and publicly apologize, and in exchange, the victim agreed not to press for physical punishment. The worker left the temple, made the payment, made his apology, and the case was resolved. This shows that the Egyptian legal system, while it could be brutal, also had mechanisms for mercy, negotiation, and restorative rather than purely punitive justice. Another interesting aspect of Egyptian punishment was the concept of collective responsibility. In some cases, especially involving serious crimes like treason or tomb robbery, not just the guilty person, but their entire family could be punished. This might mean execution for the main perpetrator and forced labor or exile for their wife and children. This seems incredibly unjust to modern sensibilities. Why punish people who didn't commit the crime? But from the Egyptian perspective, it made sense in several ways. First, it increased the deterrent effect. If you knew that committing treason wouldn't just get you killed but would also destroy your family, you'd think twice. Second, it prevented family members from benefiting from the crime. If a tomb robber was executed but his family kept the stolen goods, where was the justice in that? Third, there was a belief that criminality could run in families, and removing the entire family prevented future crimes. We see this in the harem conspiracy. Not only were the main conspirators executed, but their families were punished as well. Some were exiled, some were sentenced to forced labor, and some had all their property confiscated by the state. But again, there was variation. Not every serious crime resulted in collective punishment. Courts had discretion to punish only the guilty party if there was no evidence that family members were involved or benefited from the crime. Let's talk about one more aspect of punishment that's really important: the role of restitution and compensation for victims. Modern criminal justice systems often focus almost entirely on punishing the offender while giving little thought to the victim. The state prosecutes the crime, the criminal goes to prison, and the victim is left to deal with their losses on their own. Ancient Egypt was different. Restoring Ma'at meant restoring balance, and that meant making victims whole again. So Egyptian courts regularly ordered restitution as part of the punishment. If you stole grain, you had to return grain plus extra. If you destroyed someone's property, you had to rebuild it or pay for its replacement. If you injured someone, you might have to pay for their medical treatment and compensate them for their inability to work. This victim-centered approach meant that crime victims had strong incentives to report crimes and pursue cases through the courts. They weren't just seeing justice done in an abstract sense, they were actually being compensated for their losses. We have many examples of this. A papyrus from the Ramesside period records a case where a man's donkey was stolen and killed. The court found the thief guilty and ordered him to provide the victim with a replacement donkey of equal quality plus additional compensation of grain valued at half the donkey's worth. The thief was also beaten as punishment for the crime itself. So there was both punishment for violating Ma'at and restitution to restore the victim's material loss. One final aspect of punishment worth mentioning is the possibility of royal pardons. The pharaoh, as the ultimate source of justice and the living embodiment of Ma'at, had the power to pardon anyone for any crime. We have records of pharaohs issuing mass pardons, often to mark their coronation or the celebration of a jubilee festival. These pardons might free people from forced labor, cancel debts, or even commute death sentences. Why would a pharaoh do this? It was seen as an act of mercy that demonstrated the king's benevolence and his power. By showing that he could punish but chose to show mercy, the pharaoh was demonstrating that he ruled through Ma'at, not through Isfet. A just king was a merciful king, at least sometimes. We also have individual cases of pardons. An ostracon from Deir el-Medina records that a worker sentenced to forced labor was pardoned after his mother appealed directly to the pharaoh during a royal visit. The pharaoh, moved by the woman's plea, ordered the worker's release. This was recorded not just as a legal act, but as an example of the pharaoh's righteousness and compassion. So to summarize this chapter, ancient Egyptian punishments ranged from fines and restitution through beatings and mutilation to forced labor and execution. The punishment was supposed to fit the crime and restore Ma'at. The system emphasized compensation for victims. It allowed for mercy through temple sanctuary and royal pardons. And while it could be brutally harsh by modern standards, it operated according to principles and procedures, not arbitrary cruelty. In the next chapter, we're going to look at a specific area of law that was absolutely crucial to Egyptian society: property and inheritance. How did Egyptians buy and sell land? What happened to property when someone died? And how did the legal system handle disputes over who owned what? This might sound dry, but I promise you, the cases are anything but boring. Chapter 5: Property and Inheritance. Who owns what and why it matters. Let's talk about property. Land, houses, livestock, tools, jewelry, everything that ancient Egyptians owned and worked hard to acquire. Because here's the thing about property. It's where law meets everyday life in the most direct way possible. You might never commit a crime serious enough to face execution, but you're definitely going to buy things, sell things, inherit things, and probably at some point argue with someone about who owns what. So here's the question for this chapter. In a civilization without computers, without central registries, without photographs or GPS coordinates, how do you keep track of who owns what? How do you prove that a piece of land is yours? And what happens when two people both claim to own the same thing? The ancient Egyptians solved these problems through a combination of written documentation, witness testimony, physical markers, and good old-fashioned community knowledge. And they took property rights very seriously because property was tied to ma'at. The stable ownership and peaceful transfer of property was part of maintaining cosmic order. Let's start with land, because in an agricultural society, land was the foundation of all wealth. Land in ancient Egypt was owned in several different ways. The pharaoh owned vast amounts of land as the ruler of Egypt. Temples owned enormous estates that supported the priesthoods and religious activities. Nobles and high officials owned large holdings that they'd received as rewards from the pharaoh. And ordinary people owned smaller plots that they farmed or built houses on. But here's what's really interesting. Even though the pharaoh was theoretically the ultimate owner of all land in Egypt, in practice, people had strong property rights that the legal system protected. If you owned a piece of land, you could buy and sell it, pass it to your heirs, rent it out, or use it as collateral for loans. And if someone tried to take it from you, you could take them to court, and the court would uphold your ownership. How did you prove you owned land? Through several types of evidence. First and most important were written deeds. When you bought land, the transaction would be documented by a scribe. The deed would describe the land's location and boundaries, name the buyer and seller, state the price paid, and list witnesses to the transaction. Both parties would mark the document, usually with their names written by the scribe or sometimes with seal impressions. The witnesses would also be recorded. These deeds were incredibly important. People kept them for generations. Remember the case of Moses? He had deeds going back 200 years proving his family's ownership. Families would store important documents in secure places, often in sealed jars, and would have copies made to prevent loss. We have thousands of these property deeds preserved. One great example is from the reign of Ramesses II, around 1250 BCE. A man named Neferhotep bought a piece of land from a woman named Mutemwia. The deed describes the land as the plot of land located north of the house of the scribe Amenhotep, south of the land of the priest Psamtek, measuring 20 cubits by 30 cubits. It states that Neferhotep paid 40 debens of copper for the land, and it lists 6 witnesses, all named with their titles and relationships to the parties. This deed could be presented in court decades later as proof of ownership. As long as the document existed and hadn't been successfully challenged, it established ownership. But written deeds weren't the only evidence. Physical boundaries were also crucial. Ancient Egyptians marked property boundaries with stone markers. These were called boundary stelae, and they were taken very seriously. Remember the wisdom literature that says, "Do not move the markers on the borders of fields"? That wasn't just moral advice. Moving someone's boundary marker was a serious crime that could lead to prosecution. We have boundary markers that survive from ancient Egypt. They're usually stones set into the ground at the corners of a property or at regular intervals along a boundary line. Some have inscriptions identifying the owner. Some have been in the same location for thousands of years. When disputes arose over boundaries, courts would examine these markers. They might send surveyors to measure the land. They would question neighbours about where they remembered the boundaries being, and they would compare all of this to any written documents that existed. There's a fascinating case from the Middle Kingdom involving a boundary dispute. 2 farmers both claimed ownership of a strip of land between their fields. Both produced deeds. but the deeds weren't entirely clear about exactly where the boundary was supposed to be. The court couldn't resolve it from the documents alone. So the court took testimony from older villagers who remembered when the original boundary had been set 40 years earlier. These elderly witnesses pointed out where the boundary markers had originally been placed. The court then ordered a survey of the land to verify the witnesses' testimony. Based on this combined evidence, they ruled in favor of one farmer and ordered the boundary markers to be reset in the correct locations. This case shows how Egyptian courts would use multiple types of evidence and would go to considerable effort to discover the truth. They weren't just flipping a coin or ruling in favor of whoever seemed more credible. They were actively investigating. Now let's talk about buying and selling property. What did that process actually look like? Let's say you wanted to buy a house. You would first negotiate with the owner about the price. Ancient Egyptians didn't use money in the way we do. They used a barter system with standardized values. Prices were calculated in debens of copper or silver, which were units of weight, but the actual payment might be made in grain, livestock, cloth, or other goods equivalent to that value. Once you agreed on a price, you would go to a scribe to formalize the transaction. The scribe would draw up a deed of sale. You would gather witnesses, usually respected members of the community who could testify to the transaction if needed later. On the appointed day, you would meet with the seller, the scribe, and the witnesses. The deed would be read aloud so everyone understood its terms. You would hand over the payment, which the witnesses would observe. The seller would formally transfer ownership of the property to you. The scribe would record all of this in the deed, and everyone would mark or seal the document. Then, and this is important, the deed would often be registered with local authorities. This wasn't always required, but it provided extra protection. If the deed was registered in the local administrative office or temple archive, there was an official record that even if you lost your copy, could prove the transaction had occurred. We have examples of these registered deeds. One papyrus from the late period is actually a collection of property records kept by a temple. It lists dozens of transactions over many years, providing a comprehensive history of property ownership in that area. When disputes arose, people could come to the temple and consult these records. What if you wanted to rent property rather than buy it? The ancient Egyptians had rental agreements too. Rental contracts specified the property being rented, the duration of the rental, and the rent to be paid. Rent was usually paid in kind, grain for agricultural land, or goods for houses or workshops. The contract would also specify who was responsible for maintenance and what would happen if the property was damaged. One rental contract from Deir el-Medina rents out a house for 1 year in exchange for monthly payments of grain. The contract specifies that the tenant must maintain the house in good condition and return it in the same state it was received. If the tenant damaged the house, they would be responsible for repairs. The contract was witnessed and binding on both parties. At the end of the rental period, if both parties were satisfied, the contract might be renewed. If not, the property would be returned to the owner. If there was a dispute about damages or unpaid rent, it would go to the local Kenbet for resolution. Now let's talk about inheritance, because this is where property law gets really interesting and really personal. When someone died in ancient Egypt, their property didn't just disappear. It passed to their heirs according to rules that combined custom, legal principle, and the wishes of the deceased as expressed in a will. The basic principle was that children inherited from their parents. Sons and daughters both had inheritance rights, though sons typically received a larger share, especially of real property like land and houses. A widow also had rights to inherit from her husband, particularly the return of her dowry and a portion of the estate to support her. But these were defaults, not absolute rules. An individual could make a will that distributed their property differently. We have many examples of wills from ancient Egypt, and they show considerable flexibility. The Will of Naunakte which I mentioned earlier, is a great example. She explicitly disinherited 4 of her 8 children for not supporting her in her old age. The will states clearly which children will receive which portions of her property. She divides land, household goods, and livestock among her 4 favoured children. The will was witnessed by the local Kenbet, which gave it legal force. Another famous will is from a man named Wa, who lived during the Middle Kingdom. Wa's will divides his property among his wife, his children, and even makes bequests to servants who had served him faithfully. He specifies exact amounts, particular items going to particular people. He even leaves instructions for his funeral and the offerings to be made at his tomb. The will is incredibly detailed and shows how much control individuals had over the disposition of their property. Wills had to be properly executed to be valid. This usually meant having them witnessed by respected community members and often registering them with authorities. If a will wasn't properly executed, or if someone claimed it had been forged or made under duress, it could be challenged in court. We have records of inheritance disputes that are absolutely fascinating. They show families fighting over property, making arguments about what the deceased really wanted, producing witnesses to testify about conversations with the deceased, and generally doing everything modern families do when arguing over an inheritance. One case, from the Ramesside period, involves siblings fighting over their father's estate. The father had made a will, but it was ambiguous about certain property. One son claimed that the father had verbally promised him the family's boat. A daughter claimed that certain jewellery had been given to her while the father was alive and therefore wasn't part of the estate. Another son claimed that he deserved a larger share because he had cared for the father during his final illness. The Kenbet heard all of these claims. They examined the written will. They questioned witnesses who had known the father. They looked at whether any property had actually been transferred before the father's death. In the end, they made a ruling that tried to honour the father's written will, while also recognising some of the verbal promises and considering fairness among the children. This kind of case would be familiar to anyone who's ever been involved in an inheritance dispute. The emotions, the arguments, the different claims about what the deceased really wanted. It's all very human and very recognisable, even across 3,000 years. One interesting aspect of Egyptian inheritance law was the concept of the house, or estate, as a unit. The family house, the land it sat on, and the core property that supported the family was often treated as a unit that should be kept together rather than divided up. This was especially true for wealthier families. In these cases, one heir, usually the eldest son, would inherit the house and core estate with the obligation to provide for other family members from its produce. Other children might receive specific bequests of movable property or smaller plots of land, but the main estate stayed intact. This practice served several purposes. It prevented valuable agricultural land from being divided into pieces too small to be economically viable. It maintained the family's social status by keeping wealth concentrated, and it ensured that the tomb cult and offerings for the deceased parents would be maintained by the heir who inherited the estate. But what happened if someone died without a will or without obvious heirs? This is where the state could step in. Property of people who died without heirs could escheat to the state, meaning it became property of the pharaoh. In practice, this often meant it was granted to temples or to loyal officials as rewards. But before this happened, courts would make serious efforts to find any possible heirs, even distant relatives. We have cases where distant cousins who hadn't seen each other in decades came forward to claim inheritance. The courts would investigate the family relationships, sometimes going back generations to verify that someone was indeed a legitimate heir. As long as a blood relationship could be proven, even distant relatives had a better claim than the state. This emphasis on keeping property in families rather than letting it revert to the state shows how important property rights were in Egyptian society. Property represented security, status, and the ability to provide for your family. Losing property to the state was seen as a kind of family failure. Let me tell you about one more fascinating aspect of property law: women's property rights. In ancient Egypt, women could own property in their own right. They could buy, sell, inherit, and bequeath property. They could enter into contracts. They could take legal action to protect their property rights. This was extraordinary for the ancient world and wouldn't be matched in Europe until modern times. We have many examples of women exercising these rights: women buying and selling land, women making wills, women taking property disputes to court, women running businesses and owning workshops. One papyrus records a property transaction where a woman named Rudet bought a piece of land using her own money, not her husband's. The deed makes this explicit. She paid for it, she owned it, and if she chose to sell it later, the money would be hers. Her husband wasn't even mentioned in the transaction. Another case involves a woman named Naunakte, different from the one I mentioned earlier, who owned several plots of agricultural land that she rented out to tenants. She managed this property herself, collected the rents, and brought legal action when tenants didn't pay. She wasn't acting through a husband or male relative. She was the property owner and landlord in her own right. This doesn't mean Egyptian society was gender equal in the modern sense. It wasn't. Men had advantages in many areas, but when it came to property law, women had rights that were genuinely remarkable for the ancient world. We'll talk more about women's legal rights in a later chapter, but I wanted to mention it here because property rights were such a crucial part of women's legal status in Egypt. So to wrap up this chapter, property law in ancient Egypt was sophisticated, well documented, and actively enforced. People had strong rights to own, buy, sell, and inherit property. Disputes were resolved through courts that examined written evidence, physical markers, and witness testimony. Wills allowed people to control what happened to their property after death, and the whole system was built on the principle that stable property ownership was essential to Ma'at. In our next chapter, we're going to shift from property to people. Specifically, we're going to look at marriage, divorce, and family law. How did Egyptians get married? What rights did spouses have? What happened when marriages broke down? And how did the law protect children? These are questions that touch on the most intimate aspects of Egyptian life, and the answers might surprise you. Chapter 6: Marriage, Divorce, and Family Law. The most personal side of justice. Let's talk about love, marriage, and everything that happens when relationships go wrong. Because here's something fascinating. The ancient Egyptians had legal protections for marriage and family that were incredibly progressive for their time. We're talking about divorce rights, child support, prenuptial agreements, and legal recognition of women's autonomy within marriage, things that wouldn't exist in many Western countries until the 20th century. So here's our question for this chapter. How does a legal system built on cosmic balance handle something as unpredictable and emotional as human relationships? The answer is that ancient Egypt approached marriage as a legal and economic partnership first and foremost. Love might bring you together, but what kept things stable was a clear legal framework, defining rights, responsibilities, and what happened if things fell apart. Let's start with how marriages actually began. And here's something that might surprise you. Ancient Egypt didn't have wedding ceremonies in the way we think of them. There were no priests officiating, no vows exchanged before the gods, no official registration with the state. Instead, marriage in ancient Egypt was essentially what we'd call a civil union. It began when a man and woman decided to live together and establish a household. That's it. You moved in together, you started sharing property and life, and you were married. But wait, you might be thinking, without any official ceremony or registration, how did anyone know you were married? How did you prove it legally? The answer is through the community and through contracts. Everyone in your community knew you were living together as a married couple. That social recognition mattered. And for legal protection, especially for the woman, many couples drew up marriage contracts that specified the terms of their union. These marriage contracts are absolutely fascinating. They're essentially prenuptial agreements, and they were remarkably detailed and fair, especially considering we're talking about a civilization from thousands of years ago. A typical marriage contract would specify what each party was bringing to the marriage. The woman would bring a dowry, which might include money, household goods, clothing, jewelry, and sometimes even land or livestock. The man would provide the household, which usually meant a house or a portion of his family's house, and the means to support the family. Crucially, the contract would specify what happened to this property if the marriage ended, either through divorce or death. And here's where it gets really interesting. The woman's dowry remained her property. If the marriage ended for any reason, she got it back. This gave women real economic security and bargaining power within marriage. Let me give you a specific example. We have a marriage contract from the Ptolemaic period between a man named Drummon and a woman named Apollonia. The contract, written in Greek but following Egyptian legal traditions, lists Apollonia's dowry in detail. Gold jewelry valued at 2 talents, clothing worth 1 talent, household furnishings worth half a talent. The contract then states that if Drummon divorces Apollonia without cause, he must return her dowry plus pay her an additional penalty of 1 talent. If Apollonia initiates the divorce, she gets her dowry back but doesn't receive the penalty. If Drummon dies first, Apollonia inherits her dowry plus a portion of the marital property. This contract protected Apollonia financially. She couldn't be divorced and left destitute. She retained ownership of her dowry throughout the marriage, and if her husband died, she was provided for. These weren't just words on paper. These were legally enforceable rights that courts would uphold. We know courts upheld these rights because we have records of cases where women sued their ex-husbands for not returning their dowries. Remember Heria from Deir el-Medina? She successfully sued her ex-husband for her dowry after their divorce. The Kenbet ruled in her favor and ordered him to return specific items that had been part of her dowry, plus additional compensation for items he'd sold or damaged. Now let's talk about what happened during marriage. What were the legal rights and responsibilities of husbands and wives? The husband was legally responsible for supporting the household. He had to provide food, clothing, shelter, and other necessities. If he failed to do this, the wife could appeal to authorities or even divorce him for non-support. The wife was responsible for managing the household, which in practice meant she had considerable authority over daily life. She controlled the household budget, managed servants if the family had any, and made decisions about food, clothing, and household purchases. In wealthier families, wives might also manage property, oversee business interests, and make investment decisions. Both spouses could own property separately. As I mentioned in the last chapter, women could buy, sell, and inherit property in their own names. A wife's separate property remained hers throughout the marriage. She didn't need her husband's permission to manage it, and he had no automatic right to it. There was also joint marital property, things acquired during the marriage through the combined efforts of both spouses. If the marriage ended in divorce, this joint property would be divided, though the exact division could vary based on circumstances and what their marriage contract specified. What about children? How did the law protect and provide for children? Children were considered precious in ancient Egypt. The society valued large families, and children represented continuity, security in old age, and the maintenance of the family's tomb cult and religious obligations after the parents died. Both parents had legal obligations to their children. They had to feed, clothe, house, and educate them. Failure to provide for children could result in legal consequences. The will of Naunakte that we discussed earlier shows the reverse of this. She disinherited children who failed to support her in old age, which was seen as violating their filial duty, just as she would have violated her parental duty if she'd failed to support them as children. Children born within marriage were automatically legitimate and had full inheritance rights. This was straightforward and didn't require any special legal recognition. But what about children born outside of marriage? This is where Egyptian law was surprisingly flexible and humane. Children born to unmarried women or to concubines still had rights. They could be recognized by their fathers and given inheritance rights, though usually smaller shares than children of the official wife. A man could make provisions for all his children in his will, regardless of their mother's status. Adoption was also legally recognized. We have adoption contracts, showing people formally adopting children, giving them full rights as heirs. Some of these adoptions were of orphans or children whose parents couldn't support them. Others were strategic, like a childless couple adopting a nephew or niece to have an heir. One adoption contract from the Middle Kingdom shows a couple adopting 3 slave children, freeing them from slavery and making them their legal heirs with full inheritance rights. The contract specifies that these adopted children will care for the adoptive parents in old age and maintain their tomb cult after death, just like biological children would. Now let's talk about the topic that probably interests you most: divorce. Ancient Egypt allowed divorce for both men and women. This was extraordinary in many ancient civilizations, and even in many modern societies until recently. Divorce was either completely forbidden or only available to men. Egyptian women could initiate divorce and walk away from marriages that weren't working. How did divorce work? Essentially, either party could end the marriage by declaring it over. There was no need to prove fault or get permission from authorities, though having legitimate grounds made the financial settlement more favorable. Legitimate grounds for divorce included adultery, abuse, failure to provide support, infertility, or simply incompatibility. If you divorced your spouse for a legitimate reason, you were entitled to a more favorable property settlement. If you divorced without cause, you still could, but you might have to pay a penalty. Let's walk through a specific divorce case from Deir el-Medina to see how this worked in practice. A worker named Hesisunabef divorced his wife Hel. We don't have all the details, but we have the property settlement that was recorded by the Kenbet. Hel received her dowry back in full. This included household goods, clothing, and some jewelry. She also received a portion of the property the couple had accumulated during their marriage, specifically some furniture and kitchenware. Additionally, Hesisunabef was ordered to pay her an amount of grain as a settlement, probably to help support her until she could remarry or establish herself independently. Interestingly, the record mentions that they had one child, a daughter. The daughter went with her mother, but Hesisunabef was ordered to continue providing support for the child, paying a specified amount of grain to Hel each month for the child's maintenance. This is child support, 3,000 years before the modern concept. The fact that this was all recorded and enforced by the Kenbet shows that divorce wasn't just a private matter. The community had an interest in ensuring it was handled fairly, that women weren't left destitute, and that children were provided for. Not all divorces were amicable, of course. We have records of bitter divorce disputes where the spouses couldn't agree on property division. One case involved a couple arguing over who got to keep the house. The husband claimed it was his family's house that he'd brought to the marriage. The wife claimed they'd built it together during their marriage, and she'd contributed her labor and resources to it. The Kenbet heard testimony from both sides and from neighbors who knew the couple. In the end, they ruled that the house would go to the husband, but he had to pay the wife compensation equal to half its value, recognizing her contribution even though the house had been on his family's land. This kind of equitable division shows that Egyptian courts tried to be fair, even in difficult cases. They weren't just applying rigid rules, they were trying to restore ma'at by ensuring both parties were treated justly. One particularly interesting aspect of Egyptian family law was the treatment of widows. When a husband died, his widow didn't automatically lose everything to his family. She had legal rights. First, she got her dowry back. This was absolutely her property and no one else had any claim to it. Second, she typically received a portion of the estate, either as specified in her husband's will or according to custom. Third, if she had minor children, she usually received guardianship of them and control of their inheritance until they came of age. A widow could remain in the family home, live off the estate's income, and maintain her social position. She could also remarry if she chose, taking her dowry with her to the new marriage. This gave widows real options and security. We have many examples of widows managing property and business interests after their husbands died. Some became quite wealthy and powerful in their own right. They would appear in court to defend their interests, make business deals, and exercise all the legal rights of any property owner. One famous example is a woman named Naunakte, yet another person with that name, who was widowed and then spent decades managing extensive property holdings. She bought and sold land, leased agricultural estates, and eventually wrote a detailed will distributing her substantial wealth among her children. She was clearly a formidable person who knew how to use the legal system to protect and advance her interests. Let's talk about one more aspect of family law that's really important: the legal protections against domestic abuse. We know that domestic violence existed in ancient Egypt, just as it does in every society. But we also have evidence that it was taken seriously and could result in legal consequences. Women could bring complaints of abuse before local courts. We have cases where women testified that their husbands had beaten them or threatened them. The courts would hear these complaints and could order punishments for the abusive husband, including beatings, fines, or in extreme cases, forced divorce with the husband having to pay penalties. One case from the Ramesside period records a woman testifying that her husband had beaten her so severely she couldn't work for several days. She brought witnesses who had seen the bruises and heard her screams. The Kenbet found the husband guilty and sentenced him to a beating himself, making the punishment fit the crime. They also warned him that if he abused his wife again, they would dissolve the marriage and he would have to return her dowry plus pay additional compensation. This wasn't an isolated case. We have multiple records of courts intervening in domestic situations to protect women and children from abuse. The system wasn't perfect, and certainly not all abuse was reported or punished. But the fact that legal remedies existed and were sometimes used shows that ma'at extended into the home. Now, let me address something important. While Egyptian women had remarkable legal rights, especially regarding property and divorce, Egyptian society was still patriarchal in many ways. Men had advantages in social status, political power, and religious roles. The ideal that wisdom literature promoted was of a harmonious household where the wife was respected and well treated, but where the husband was clearly the head of the family. The reality, as with all ideals, varied. Some households were partnerships of equals. Some were dominated by strong-willed women who ran everything. Some were oppressive situations where women suffered despite having legal rights they couldn't effectively exercise. Ancient Egypt was a diverse society spanning 3,000 years, and family dynamics varied enormously. But what's important for understanding the legal system is that women had rights. They could own property, they could divorce, they could go to court, they could protect their interests. These weren't just theoretical rights. Women actually used them, as the thousands of legal documents involving women prove. One final story to illustrate all of this. There's a case from the late period involving a woman named Timehotep. She was married to a high priest named Psempta. They had a good marriage by all accounts, but Psemptep died relatively young, leaving Timehotep a widow. Imhotep successfully claimed her dowry and her share of the estate. She took over management of their considerable property. She raised their children, and then she did something unusual. She commissioned a biographical inscription for her husband's tomb, but she wrote it from her own perspective, describing their life together and her grief at his death. In this inscription, she mentions that they had drawn up a marriage contract at the beginning of their union, specifying their respective property rights. She notes that this contract ensured she was provided for after his death, and she describes how she's now using her property rights to honor his memory by maintaining his tomb cult. This inscription shows us several things: the importance of marriage contracts, the property rights of widows, the legal framework that allowed women to manage substantial estates, and the human reality behind all these legal documents. These were real people who loved each other, built lives together, and used the legal system to protect and provide for each other. So to wrap up this chapter, Egyptian family law provided a framework for marriage that protected both parties, especially women. Marriage contracts specified property rights and divorce settlements. Divorce was available to both men and women. Children had to be supported, even after divorce. Widows had rights to property and support, and courts would intervene to enforce these rights and protect vulnerable family members. All of this was built on the foundation of Ma'at. Families were supposed to be harmonious units, where everyone was treated fairly. When that harmony was disrupted, whether through divorce, abuse, or disputes over property, the legal system existed to restore balance. In our next chapter, we're going to look at contracts and commerce. How did ancient Egyptians do business? What kinds of contracts did they use? How were debts handled? And what happened when business deals went wrong? We're going to explore the economic side of Egyptian law, and you'll see that these ancient people were remarkably sophisticated in how they structured their economic relationships. Chapter 7: The Final Judgment, Law, Legacy, and What It All Means. We've journeyed through 7 chapters exploring the ancient Egyptian legal system. We've seen courts and judges, crimes and punishments, property and inheritance, marriage and divorce. We've read about real cases involving real people who lived thousands of years ago. But now, as we come to the end of our journey, let's step back and ask the biggest question of all. What does all of this mean? Why should we care about how ancient Egyptians handled legal disputes? What can a legal system from 3,000 years ago possibly teach us today? The answer, I think, is profound. The ancient Egyptian legal system shows us that the human desire for justice is timeless. The specific laws change, the procedures evolve, the punishments shift with cultural values, but the fundamental need for a system that resolves disputes, punishes wrongdoing, protects the vulnerable, and maintains social order, that's universal and eternal. Let's talk about what made the Egyptian legal system work for so long. Remember, we're talking about a civilization that lasted 3,000 years. That's longer than the entire history of Christianity. That's longer than any modern nation has existed. What allowed their legal system to function effectively for such an enormous span of time? First, and most importantly, was the foundation of Ma'at. By tying law to cosmic order, by making justice a religious obligation rather than just a political one, the Egyptians created a system that had tremendous moral authority. You weren't just obeying the Pharaoh's laws, you were maintaining the order of the universe. This gave the system legitimacy that purely secular law might not have had. Second was the flexibility of the system. Because Egyptian law wasn't codified in rigid written codes, it could adapt to changing circumstances. Judges could consider the specific facts of each case, could balance competing principles, could reach decisions that restored Ma'at in creative ways. This flexibility meant the system could handle new situations without requiring constant legislative updates. Third was the accessibility of the system, at least relative to many other ancient civilizations. Yes, wealthy people had advantages. Yes, scribal fees could be burdensome, but ordinary people could and did use the courts. The Kenbet system meant that your neighbors, people who understood your circumstances, would judge your disputes. This made justice feel achievable rather than distant and impossible. Fourth was the emphasis on documentation. By writing everything down, by preserving records, by maintaining archives, the Egyptians created a legal system with memory. Precedents could be consulted, property rights could be verified generations later. This gave people confidence that their legal rights wouldn't just disappear. Fifth was the integration of law with other aspects of society. Law wasn't separate from religion, from economics, from family life. It was woven through everything. This meant that legal principles reinforced social norms and vice versa. Ma'at was something you learned as a child, practiced in your family, saw demonstrated in temples, and had enforced in courts. Now let's talk about what the Egyptian legal system tells us about the people themselves. Because ultimately, a legal system reflects the values and priorities of the culture that creates it. The Egyptians clearly valued stability and order. So much of their law was about maintaining boundaries, respecting property rights, honoring agreements, and preserving social harmony. This makes sense for an agricultural society dependent on the predictable flooding of the Nile and the stable functioning of irrigation systems. Chaos was the enemy. Order was essential for survival. They also valued fairness, at least as an ideal. The constant invocation of Ma'at, the instructions to judges to treat rich and poor equally, the provisions protecting widows and orphans, these all show a society that believed justice should be impartial. Yes, the reality often fell short, but the ideal mattered. They valued family and continuity. The elaborate inheritance laws, the protections for children, the maintenance of tomb cults, the importance of honouring parents. All of this shows a society oriented toward linking past, present, and future. You weren't just an individual. You were a link in a chain connecting ancestors and descendants. They valued property rights strongly. The extensive documentation of land ownership, the sophisticated contracts, the careful preservation of deeds going back generations. This shows a society where economic security was important and where the law protected people's legitimate possessions. And interestingly, they valued women's rights to a degree that was unusual in the ancient world. The property rights, the divorce rights, the ability to appear in court, these weren't granted to women in many civilizations until modern times. What does this tell us about Egyptian society? Perhaps that in a civilization so dependent on maintaining Ma'at, excluding half the population from legal protections would have been seen as creating imbalance and disorder. Now, let's address the limitations and problems with the Egyptian legal system, because they existed and they were significant. The use of torture to extract confessions was brutal and could lead to false confessions and wrongful convictions. We know this happened. The system had no protections against it because Egyptians genuinely believed torture revealed truth. The punishments could be horrifically cruel by modern standards. Mutilation, impalement, burning, these punishments caused immense suffering. Even if we understand them in their cultural context, we can acknowledge their brutality. The system favored the wealthy and powerful. While Ma'at preached equality, reality was different. A rich person could afford better scribes, could bribe officials, could bring influence to bear in ways poor people couldn't. This is true of most legal systems throughout history, but it's still a significant failing. Women had remarkable rights compared to other ancient societies, but they still lived in a patriarchal system where men held most political and religious power. Legal rights only matter if you can effectively exercise them, and social pressure and practical circumstances often limited women's ability to use their legal rights. The system could be painfully slow. Cases sometimes dragged on for years or even generations, as the land dispute of Mose shows. Justice delayed is justice denied, and many people probably suffered while waiting for their cases to be resolved. And of course, the entire system was built on a hierarchical society that accepted slavery, that treated people differently based on social status, and that had no concept of universal human rights as we understand them today. These limitations matter. We can appreciate what was sophisticated about Egyptian law without whitewashing what was problematic. But here's what I find most remarkable about studying the ancient Egyptian legal system. These people who lived so long ago, in such a different world, were fundamentally trying to accomplish the same things we're still trying to accomplish today. They wanted a way to resolve disputes without violence. They wanted to protect property rights. They wanted to punish criminals. They wanted to protect vulnerable people. They wanted justice that was fair and impartial. They wanted a stable, orderly society where people could live their lives without constant fear of theft, violence, or arbitrary oppression. And for 3,000 years, with all its flaws and limitations, their legal system helped them achieve these goals. It wasn't perfect. It was often harsh. It reflected the inequalities and values of its time, but it worked well enough to support one of history's greatest civilizations. What's the legacy of the Egyptian legal system? It's hard to trace direct influences because Egyptian law didn't spread the way Roman law did. Egypt was eventually conquered by the Greeks, then the Romans, then the Arabs, and each conquest brought new legal traditions. But some scholars argue that Egyptian legal concepts, particularly regarding property rights and contracts, influenced Greek law, which influenced Roman law, which became the foundation for much of modern Western law. If this is true, then we might all be distant inheritors of legal principles first developed on the banks of the Nile thousands of years ago. More broadly, the Egyptian legal system shows us that sophisticated law is not a modern invention. People in the ancient world were capable of creating complex, nuanced legal systems that balance competing principles and serve their societies effectively. This should give us humility about our own legal systems, which future generations will probably see as primitive in their own ways. As we close our journey through ancient Egyptian law, I want you to think about one final thing. Somewhere around 1200 BCE, a worker named Amenacht had his donkey stolen. He reported it to the police. He appealed to his supervisors when the investigation stalled. Eventually, presumably, he got some kind of resolution, though we don't have the final outcome recorded. Amenacht has been dead for more than 3,000 years. His donkey is long gone. The police officer he complained about is dust. The officials he appealed to are forgotten, but his complaint survives. We can still read his words. We can still see his appeal to Ma'at, his demand for justice. And in that survival, in that connection across millennia, we see something profound. The human need for justice transcends time, culture, and civilization. Amenacht wanted the same thing anyone would want today if their property was stolen. He wanted his loss acknowledged. He wanted the wrong made right. He wanted justice. The ancient Egyptian legal system, for all its strangeness to our modern eyes, for all its brutality and limitations, was trying to provide that justice. It was trying to maintain Ma'at, cosmic balance and order, by ensuring that wrongs were righted and disputes were resolved. And for 3,000 years, longer than any legal system has existed before or since, it succeeded. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but well enough to support a civilization that built pyramids, developed sophisticated art and literature, and left a legacy that still fascinates us today. So the next time you sign a contract, or go to court, or call the police, or write a will, or get married or divorced, or argue about property rights, remember Amenacht and his stolen donkey. Remember Mose and his centuries-long land dispute. Remember Naunakte disinheriting her ungrateful children. Remember all the people whose lives and legal disputes we've explored together. They lived in a different world, but they faced the same fundamental challenges we face. How do we live together peacefully? How do we resolve disputes fairly? How do we protect the vulnerable? How do we punish wrongdoing? How do we maintain order while allowing freedom? These questions have no perfect answers, but the ancient Egyptians' attempt to answer them, their creation of a legal system based on ma'at, on cosmic truth and justice, deserves our respect and our study. Because in understanding how they approach these eternal questions, we might gain insight into how we can better approach them ourselves. Thank you for taking this journey through the ancient Egyptian legal system with me. I hope you've learned something fascinating. I hope you've gained appreciation for the sophistication of ancient civilizations. And I hope you've seen that the human quest for justice is as old as civilization itself, and just as vital today as it was 3,000 years ago on the banks of the Nile. Ma'at, truth, justice, balance, and order. May we all strive to maintain it in our own lives and in our own time.